Hello everyone and welcome to this, our Module 14 lecture, Economic and Social Policy. So I'm excited about this lecture because I think it ties together some interesting things for us that we've kind of hit upon a few times over the course of the semester, and we got to sort of talk about some of these things in detail here, which is nice. So one of the themes of the lecture really is the idea of the importance of a sort of a foundational myth that the economy and the realm of politics are things that are separate, okay? And what I really want to try to focus on with you is the idea that those two things are actually fundamentally linked together. The way we often are told by people on television or by the talking heads, by the so-called experts, is that the economy is a scientific reality, that it exists as a sphere of human interaction all unto itself, with its own specific dynamics, with its own specific patterns of behavior, and also its needs, right? So for the economy to function, it needs to be kind of carved off from the political part of our lives, from the social part of our lives, and that we need to kind of tend to it. The problem with this approach is that it tends to make the economy something that we work for, that we work to maintain, that we work to sort of keep buoyant. What we can forget about that sometimes when we're dealing with the economy in that kind of way is that really there's another perspective. There's another perspective which says the economy is there as something to serve us, right? It's there to serve human needs. It's a human creation that actually it's deeply political, and that it can be useful to us in terms of achieving goals, political goals, social goals, justice goals, right? So if we treat the economy as a scientific realm all unto its own, with its own laws and regularities that exist almost somehow separately to human needs and desires, then all of that falls to the wayside. All of those other questions about what the economy can be for and what the economy can accomplish and help us do as human beings, right? Is it a tool or are we its tool? I guess that's the question, right? If you're an economist, sometimes it can sound like we are the tool of the economy because our goal is to make the sacrifices to make it work. But actually that's really up for question, and what I want to sort of focus on in this lecture is the idea that the economy can be put to work for us and successfully over the generations. If you get lost in this lecture, come back to this, right? What we're going to be calling fiscal policy, the same type of policy that was introduced during the Great Depression to help resolve the problems that America was facing during the time of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Those policies really did put human beings first, and they put the economy second. But here's the upshot: prosperity was maintained. In fact, perhaps even increased, because one of the arguments here is that, and this comes straight from the era of the 1930s and 40s when economists were thinking this way, if you treat the economy as its own sacred thing, invariably it will be hijacked by the powerful interests, powerful business interests, powerful corporate concerns who may, and historically this has actually proven to be the case, co-opted and used the economic system for their own advantage. Okay, so oddly they're the ones telling us most of the time that the economy is not really for politics, it's not really for political intervention. Best to keep the government and the economy separate, shrink the government, small government. So we have this curious paradox then whereby the economy, its defenders, oftentimes are the people who have the greatest vested interest in the economy being a sort of a loose and free realm where a great number of risks can be taken. And because we don't see the economy interconnected with social life and political life most of the time, then when a crisis comes, we're not ready. We're not ready because we don't understand that those links always existed, even though the ideology, the pretext for the separation of economic life and social life was telling us that in fact the economy was not political at all. So those interconnections are always there, and that's the bottom line I'm trying to get across in this lecture, that the economy and the political are fundamentally implicated. When the experts tell us that that's not so, usually they're trying to hide something over, I would argue. And this is from a political science perspective. Obviously, to a certain extent, you want to create a bit of isolation for the economy to help it function, but to somehow say that the economy and the social and the political are not interrelated can actually end you up in a lot of trouble. And that's actually one of the arguments I'll be presenting in this lecture vis-a-vis the 2008 financial crisis, which clearly has had major ramifications for social justice and social planning. Since then, and we're 5 years, 6 years later now, it's still having repercussions not just here in America, but around the world as well. So in this outline, we just see the points that we're going to be covering in the lecture, and I'll talk you through those right now. And I'm going to make a couple of other points as well while we're here. The inset little image here is a cover of a novel, From Farm Boy to Senator, and basically this is a kind of a Horatio Alger novel, and the Horatio Alger novels are kind of our stories rather are very important for understanding American economic culture. There's this strong idea and myth deep in American culture that this is the land of opportunity. You can achieve pretty much anything if you set your mind to it and you work hard. If you're willing to work hard, nothing can hold you back. Many Americans subscribe to this myth. It's a popular myth in schools and in society and in media, in popular fiction, and the the status of the myth means that most Americans believe that it's inappropriate ethically or morally to try to regulate or interfere or hold people back in any particular way, right? So it's kind of a moral narrative or belief of the right that people have to success and comfort and to own the fruits of their labor if they work hard. Okay, so that I want you guys to hold that in your minds for a second, because if that's the dominant myth of American political life, obviously it's going to shape policy to a certain extent, and it's going to make certain types of things more difficult than others policy-wise. Now, the second myth that we've talked about already in the opening slide was the myth of economic science, and I won't go through that again, of course, but just to sort of remind you that the idea here is that the economy is something separate to human life, and that it needs to be maintained as a separate sphere, and that its health is something we will only sacrifice after we've made significant sacrifices and compromises to our own lives. Okay, so we put the economy first, we put our own lives second, really. And so you can sort of see how the two myths relate to each other. Horatio Alger myth, saying that this is the land of opportunity. If I can work hard, I will be a success and comfortable and wealthy. And then the other, this idea that the economy is a separate realm to the realm of social or family activity. It's an activity, a sphere of interaction all of its own that takes place in a space called a market. And actually, I think in the context of the 2008 financial crisis that happened, it's clear that these two narratives really came into play because people on the one hand saw the problem of the big banks, and we'll discuss this later in the lecture. They saw the problem of the big banks having over-leveraged, having taken too many risks, okay? But instead of sort of looking at the problem as a structural problem where these banks needed to be sanctioned or perhaps punished for misbehaving, the economists instead looked at the problem as a systemic problem particular to the amount of liquidity in the economy. Now, what does liquidity mean? Not to get too detailed about it, but liquidity is the amount of cash circulating in the economy. Liquidity is about the amount or the relative ease with which you or I can convert our assets into cash, and and how easily we can get cash based on the strength of our assets. So if we have low interest rates in an economy, that means I can borrow on my assets quite easily. Then we can say the economy has a lot of liquidity. But if interest rates are high, and that can be for a variety of reasons, it can be caused by government setting interest rates highly, or it can be caused by genuinely a lack of cash circulating in the economy. That means the cost of money is high based on its supply and demand. Then we can say that is an illiquid economy as well. So if the banks of 2008 were collapsing, they were about to suck a whole bunch of cash out of the economy with them. The experts saw the problem as a liquidity problem, and they saw that the economy needed to be fixed. They saw that the liquidity problem in the economy needed to be fixed at pretty much any cost. So that's really what their plan was, right? Was to basically bail out the banks at the cost of the public taxpayer, and the taxpayer would carry the cost, despite the fact that it was the banks who'd taken the risks and the banks that had engaged in the hazardous behavior in the first instance. We were actually going to bail them out. Now, if you asked a non-economist about this situation, somebody who might see the economy from a political or from a social perspective, where the economy should serve us as opposed to us serving it, you got a very different story in all of this. But it wasn't the story that got told in the media. It wasn't the story that got related in the news. The major networks and the politicians all basically pledged allegiance to the liquidity crisis story, the liquidity crisis account of what had happened in the financial crisis. And the point here really is that we typically see the economy then as something that is not subservient to politics. You can see that quite clearly in the financial crisis. Our policy shows that we put the economy first, not politics, and that we tend to let economists and economic experts do their thing. We give them their own space to operate in. We think of their realm as something separate to our own. However, once you actually start to do the digging, once you realize the vested interests that were in play to create the policy framework, to endorse the language of these economists, at work in universities, at work in places like places like policy institutes, where they can be quite vocal and get the ear of our politicians, you realize in fact that despite the fact that we're being told that the economy is something scientifically identifiable as separate to politics, actually it's fundamentally political. And so those two myths, the myth of the self-starter, which of course gets people to think of their prosperity as their own responsibility, and the myth of the economy is something separate, which means that we don't like to interfere with it and make it subservient to political or social ends, combine together to give us the kind of economic culture that we have in America today, where the financial crisis of 2008 is possible and where people are willing to let these banks be bailed out and call it a liquidity solution. But actually, really, what it is rewarding rich people for quite errant behavior and punishing the rest for things that were no fault of their own. So, so with that in mind, with that sort of contemporary context and contemporary situation in mind, we should really think about the history of how we got here, how we arrived at this point. And to tell that story, we have to look at the democratic debate over the money supply, which of course is an abstract debate, but as you'll see as we discuss the history of American social and economic policy since World War II, we'll see that really this debate is crucially important, especially in the 1970s, when we see a shift away from what might be called a more fiscal policy type framework to a more supply side policy framing of social policy and economic ideology. So did elite interests suddenly hijack and take over in the 1970s? I don't know that that's quite my argument. I think elite interests and ideologies were always there, but the economy was really in a bad shape during the Great Depression. And what they realized, I think, was that they had to go with this other ideology that I mentioned in the last slide, the ideology that says that when people are doing well, the economy is doing well. And the economy had to be basically politicized after World War II because that was the only way that prosperity in the economy could grow again. And it's paradoxical if you think about the kind of things that Glenn Beck, or Bill O'Reilly argue today on the television. They're constantly complaining about socialism in the economy and government intervention in the economy. But really, if you know your economic history, you know that after World War II, the only way the economy really could be repaired, and the elites knew this, and that's why they went along with it, was through fiscal economics. So we want to talk about all these things then, the rise and fall of the Keynesian consensus after World War II, supply-side economics and the debate over the deficit that sort of starts to reframe and recharacterize the nature of economic policy in the 1970s, and then kind of update that to the contemporary framework by discussing social policy and also healthcare reform, and ask about the extent to which Obamacare can be said to be characterized by a popular democratic perspective, again using this framing that we've been invoking since the start of the semester that goes along with our textbook, whether we want to use a popular democratic perspective or a elite democratic perspective to understand and analyze Obamacare. And then we'll have some words in conclusion. So let's talk about the democratic debate over the money supply. Now there's a lot of terminology here on this screen, but I've tried to keep it minimal. So the first term we really need to address, and this is not an economics lecture, so I'm going to try to avoid getting too deep into the abstracts here, but we're going to have to focus a little bit on some of these terms if we want to understand what the hell it is we're talking about. So macroeconomic policy, well, the business of government, most contemporary governments in the Western world and indeed around the world, definitely, at least to some extent, concerns making sure that markets function smoothly. Governments are there to make sure that the markets are able to carry out their function of moving goods and services around to allocate them where they're needed in the economy. When governments don't do this job well, typically there's hell to pay. And there's a lot of evidence to show what happens to countries whose governments mess up macroeconomic policy. If you go to the 1997 Asian financial crisis, for example, you see a classic bubble bursting there. This was a price bubble where the regional governments had allowed property markets to soar through inwards investment from overseas for the large part, and create an artificial price bubble where the assets, the buildings, skyscrapers in Taiwan and Hong Kong and places like this, really were overvalued, and there was not enough demand in terms of people actually needing to live in them to warrant the value, but the market had been betting up the value just to sort of sit on these assets. Not that people were living in the houses, but they were just sort of sitting on them because they were gaining value so quickly. So the Asian financial crisis happened when that bubble burst. Now, there's a lot of different reasons about why the 97 Asian financial crisis happened. Some people say it was to do with local factors, other people say it was more to do with global factors, but the reality is it was a classic example of what can happen when important macroeconomic variables like the price of houses are not scrutinized by the government. And update that to 2008, and basically you see something like a replay, in many ways anyway, of the 97 Asian financial crisis right here in the United States of America, only because the United States of America is such a big economy proportionately to the global economy, where the Asian financial crisis was relatively self-contained. It had a little bit of exposure to Russia and to the United States via Russia with a bank called Long-Term Capital Management. But the United States economy in 2008 is a lot bigger than the Asian economy in 97, and so consequently, really, the entire global economic system took a hit when, in 2008, Wall Street banks started to go bust from having taken too many risks. So that's the importance of macroeconomic policy then, and it speaks to the importance that and the significance of governments taking macroeconomic policy seriously. Now, there's two basic tools that governments can use to help control the economy and to maintain stability in the economy. One is called fiscal policy, and that's kind of your classic, a lot of people know this sort of frame of tax and spend government, right? Now, tax and spend government exists for a reason. We complain about it a lot, but we don't always understand why governments do this. Are they doing it just to benefit themselves? Actually, that's probably rarely the case. The government is a complex system where they have very, very detailed statistics and figures on what kind of government services are needed and where they are needed. So to allocate these on society, government, of course, raises revenue through tax, sometimes through borrowing, and also then spends these monies to put these services in place. But that's the day-to-day stuff. A fiscal policy perspective takes a sort of a secondary or sort of macro level stance on the significance of these sorts of policies vis-a-vis the economy itself, right? Government is a big player in the economy, and it employs a lot of people, and its actions matter. So this is what Keynes, and we'll talk about Keynes in the next slide, the British economist from the 1940s observed, right, is that government is such a big player in the economy that if the economy starts doing badly, government can step in and restore some of the sort of dissipated energy of the economy. It can and it does this by increasing demand. Demand, of course, is what you and I have when we go to the supermarket and look for vegetables, for example. If carrots, are in demand this season because it's carrot season, for example. I'm not saying it's carrot season, but you know what I mean. Then there'll be a lot of people going to the grocery store looking for carrots, which means carrots might get more expensive because there's fewer, relatively speaking, to go around because more people are looking for them. So Keynes observed all of this, and he understood that in a recession, part of the problem can be that demand is weak, that demand is low. Those carrots are just not being demanded, so farmers are not growing them so much, right? So the supply of carrots is decreasing, and this is exactly what happened in the Great Depression. Whether it's carrots or cars, automobiles, or ships, or airplanes, or cans of Coke, producers were not producing because people didn't have money in the Great Depression to buy things. Keynes argued that you could fix that by getting money back into people's pockets, by the government basically giving them a job, and then they would go to the grocery store more. And if they were going to the grocery store more, private enterprise would see what was happening and then respond by stepping up production, and to step up production, they would step up employment. So you start, using government policy, you start a virtuous cycle and return the economy to its rightful speed, and then, of course, once that's happened, government can step back. Government doesn't need to be employing people anymore because the private sector is doing it on its own. So, clearly, those policies have a history of working, and they have been useful to economic planners over the decades. But they were especially useful during the Great Depression. A contrary policy to that is monetary policy. Again, we'll discuss this in more detail later in the lecture, but monetary policy uses government's control over the money supply. And what is the money supply? It's the amount of cash circulating in the economy, to also try to affect, change, and regulate the energy in the economy. If the energy is dissipating, and when I say energy dissipating, what I really mean is demand dissipating, right? If demand is weak, monetary policy can be used to make money more available to people. If the government drops its interest rates in the Federal Reserve, which is the central bank of the United States of America that loans money to other banks overnight, then effectively they can give an incentive for people to borrow money because interest rates are low. Now, if that happens, people will invest that money in productive activity, and they will employ people, and jobs and prosperity will return to the economy. So that's another way of influencing the economy in a time of weak demand, effectively making money cheaper to people. Now that obviously has potential to work in certain instances. However, as we'll see, there's a criticism of that John Maynard Keynes had, and we'll get to that in just a moment. So anyway, those are your two basic policies, fiscal policy and monetary policy. Now, as you might expect, given the framework we've been developing this semester, there's a debate about all of this, right? We've already talked about it at length in other contexts, but here too, just as elsewhere, we have a debate between elite Democrats and the popular Democrats. They are quick to contest the relative merits of each of these different policies, and truth be told, the different policies favor different entities. I've already hinted at that at length in my introduction. Elites tend to favor monetary policy. Why? Well, because a tight money supply, that is to say, if interest rates are high and borrowing is expensive, and some people can refer to this as austerity. So if you're hearing the word austerity these days, this kind of refers to this sort of idea that you can sort of have a policy that's based on a tight money supply. But what does it do? Why would you want money supply to be tight? Well, a tight money supply doesn't really benefit the average person, but it can be beneficial for elites, especially financial elites, because they want to maintain their profit margins. They want to have the cheapest costs possible to them as they strive to manufacture widgets for circulation in the economy. Okay, so if wages are tightening, then employment is more abundant, right, and cheaper to buy effectively, right? People have less money to spend, so the government, the private employer will be able to incentivize them to enter into the labor market, to increase their wages, to survive, to put bread on the table. So there's a paradox here, however, and that's the problem. That's where things start to get debated, because while it sounds good, while it sounds that it's best to have a tight money supply and not to have interest rates too low, to create a sort of a demand for work on the part of the masses of people, demand for jobs, then you might say that's a great motivation for entrepreneurialism. It's a great motivator for working hard and being industrious, and indeed all of those things are true. But there's a paradox, because if people have less money, the problem is they will buy less. If your labor force is not able to borrow, if your labor force is not very well paid, then your profits may be higher, and that's benefiting the financial elites, and people might be working harder, and that looks like a more industrious and entrepreneurial society. But the gains may be short-lived, because overall the consumption in the society is declining. If you've made money expensive, you've also made consumption expensive, and that itself, while cheap labor might feed the profits of corporations, a reduced long-term pattern in consumption will definitely hurt corporations' profits in the longer run. So actually monetary policy can only really be used in the short term. In the longer term, you need an investment strategy. You need to be building an actual sort of energetic framework to supply jobs in the long run. And that's why popular Democrats, if elite Democrats favor high interest rates and a tight money supply, popular Democrats tend to favor the opposite. They tend to favor loose monetary policies so as to make it easier for people, especially on the margins, to borrow, to invest, to be entrepreneurial, to enter into the workforce and on terms of their own choosing. So that's the debate about money supply. In recent years, obviously, this debate has had major sort of consequences for how we have governed our financial system. You know about the 2008 financial crisis. The Federal Reserve under Benjamin Bernanke had to step in to rescue these two major Wall Street banks because they were so-called too big to fail. And as I said in the introduction, letting these banks go could have created a huge problem for the United States economy. These banks were too big to fail, as the saying went, and so it's often thought of that the government didn't have any other choice but to guarantee the liquidity in the system. But many people would question that, and they would say that it's important to think about this sort of bigger question. And a bigger question would be to do not so much with the specific decisions the government made to bail out the banks or not to bail out the banks, but how is it that we allowed the banks to become so big that they could be too big to fail? How is it that we live in a system that allows these gigantic entities, which in their death could actually end up shooting a bullet right through the heart of the entire economy? How is it that we live in a system that could allow that to pertain? In 2013, we've had a new chair, first lady chair of the Federal Reserve Bank. As I said, it's the central bank of the United States of America. Her name is Janet Yellen. She has been talking about changing some of these things, and it'll be interesting to see, although she's very new still on the job, it'll be interesting to see how her time in this office plays out. The question that she'll be asking as she takes the reins is precisely, though, the one that we've been debating. Do we want the experts to be deciding how we regulate the economy? Do we want the economy to be served by the people for its own sake? Or do we deserve a system that works for us? Do we deserve a system that prevents too big to fail from happening? If we can have a good Fed chair, she will be encouraging Congress, she will be encouraging the president to break up big banks, to make sure that those large monopolies are impossible, and that we keep them at a manageable size where the impact of their corruption or their manipulation of the system will be minimized. So in this slide, we discuss fiscal policy, the rise and fall of the Keynesian consensus. And to talk about this, the first thing to say, I suppose, is we're going back in time a little bit. We're going back to a time before the financial crisis of 2008, before the transformation of the U.S. economy in the 1970s. We're going all the way back to the era of the interwar years, the Great Depression, and the resolution called the Bretton Woods meeting that happened in Bretton Woods in New Hampshire. And one of the key figures of the time in economic planning, by the name of John Maynard Keynes, a British man, who basically put forward the idea that was central to the problem, resolving the problem of the New Deal and helping to design the regulative framework for the global economy after World War II. Again, that was known as the Bretton Woods system. So Keynes's key idea was that you can fix a depression, you can resolve problems like a depression or a recession in the economy through deficit spending, right? That the government can borrow in order to fix the economy, and that's a good idea. The government should borrow during a recession. This was his key argument. So long as the resources were being used wisely, then you actually would be able to grow the pie, as John McCain would say. You could grow the economy, and while you would go into debt to do so, the debt would stay the same size while your economy grew bigger, and therefore proportionately to the economy you could pay it back. So okay, the argument about having nothing to fear from borrowing. But let's get into the meat and potatoes. What did Keynesian economics actually advocate? Well, basically, the idea is that in a capitalist economy, there's going to be a tendency for employers not to employ all the available workers. And the question is, why might that be so? Well, basically, there's an incentive for employers not to employ everyone because they understand that labor is a commodity, like potato chips are a commodity, or wool is a commodity. If you have lots and lots of demand for it in a society, it gets more expensive. Those carrots we discussed in the last slide, if you have a lot of demand for carrots, the carrots get more expensive. And so employers don't want to see labor becoming too expensive as a commodity because it's going to add costs to their bottom line and it's going to cut into their ability to make a profit. It makes sense when you put it that way, no? So the problem here is that if you sustain too much unemployment, right? If you this is Keynes's argument. If employers take this logic too far, if they sustain unemployment too much, then you're actually going to corrode the possibility for labor, broadly speaking, to consume in the society, and that can actually undermine the potential of employers to supply the motivation that employers have to produce and supply to the economy. So I guess Keynes's point then, if you think about it, is that there's a paradox, right? Employers don't want to employ everyone, but if there's too much unemployment, then demand in the society becomes very, very weak, and so there has to be some kind of balance there. This is what Keynes was arguing, and if ultimately you look at the time that he was working in, which was the time of the Great Depression, you can see that there was a lot of truth to his argument about this paradox, because at the time, kind of oddly, eerily similar to the situation we're in today. If you have ever looked at the savings of large enterprises at the moment, like Apple, sitting on hundreds of millions of dollars in cash, not really using it for productive investment. The same thing was going on back in the Great Depression. Businesses had a lot of cash. They were saving their money rather than putting that money to work in building things and employing workers. And basically that was because there was no demand for carrots in the grocery store. Now, what was the solution? What could you do about it? Keynes said that one way you could figure this out, one way you could resolve the problem would be to manipulate consumer demand. That is to say, for government to step in and create demand by manipulating the consumers. And I don't mean manipulating like against their interests. I simply mean that as a inverted commas demand side economist, what he wanted to do was motivate people to get out and buy things again. And the way you do that, he suggested, was basically by getting government to employ people. Now, obviously, just in the short term, and I explained this in a last slide or the slide before, but if you listen to today's rhetoric, Glenn Beck and other people like that, Bill Riley, you get a lot of people saying that government participation in the economy is a type of socialism. Well, it might be arguably socialism if you do it in the long term, but for Keynes, the solution was simply to do it sometimes in the short term when the economy wasn't really being stimulated by private business interests, when those private business interests were, as we say, just sitting on cash, right? If you have the government step in to employ people so that they have the cash to buy stuff like carrots in the supermarket, then once people are buying stuff again, with money in their pockets, the business community has to respond. It has to increase the amount of products like carrots that it's making available to the supermarkets. And to do that, it's going to start employing people. And once the employment has been taken up, the government can retreat from the market. So in this sense then, historically speaking, that's a Keynesian argument, and that argument has been used to in Europe, for example, successively through the decades, largely through redistributive wealth projects. Famously, Keynes had argued, in a recession, what you do is you hire an army of people to go out and bury gold bars in the jungle or in the woods, and then you hire another army of people to go out and dig those gold bars up again. And he was basically tongue-in-cheek saying, it almost doesn't matter really what you get people doing, so long as you get them working and so long as you get cash into their hands, and then the economy becomes buoyant again. In the United States, it should be noted that this has been interpreted a little bit differently historically because of the United States' position as a superpower. There's been a strong temptation to engage not in welfare Keynesianism but in military Keynesianism. And military Keynesianism is where you're taking those principles of government investment in the economy, but you're doing it through the production of military armaments, and that's a key part of the history of American fiscal policy. Now, in this slide, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of how Keynesian economics came to be shoved aside, and how supply-side economics crept into the limelight. Now, Keynesian economics is demand side because, as you know, the whole goal was to use fiscal intervention to create demand among employees. For government to step in and create jobs for people so that they would have cash in their hand and they would go to the supermarket and buy those carrots and buy other things too, of course. There is another way of looking at economic problems, and it must be said, I suppose, that not always are you going to have an economic problem that Keynesian economics can fix. At least many economists made that point in the 1970s, when the Keynesian viewpoint that had been dominant for about 30 years began to crumble. By 1970, of course, you have the Vietnam War, you have increased domestic spending, and you have government starting to get into deficit spending in order to finance all of this, right? So it required borrowing from overseas in order to finance this. Now, why might that matter? It matters because in order to pay for this, the U.S. economy was effectively printing money. It was running the printing presses to itself, writing itself blank checks, and borrowing, it must be said, to an extent. And with this money, of course, it could pay for the things that it needed to pay for. But there's a problem, because the United States was integrated into a global economy and had been since World War II the numeraire, which means that it was the key currency that the US dollar, rather, was the numeraire, and it was the key currency that all the countries that were plugged into this global financial system. Obviously, the Eastern Bloc countries were not so involved in this, but the Western countries certainly were using the US dollar as a reserve currency in their central banks. So why would they do that? They would do that because after World War II, after the Bretton Woods Institution meetings, the policymakers in the United States government had agreed to link the US dollar to an exact amount of gold, and they would hold gold in the US Treasury to be used to pay people to make good that the promise of the US dollar was linked to a certain amount of gold. Now, if the US is printing money to pay for the Vietnam War and borrowing from overseas, it begins to look like maybe there's not enough gold in the central bank to cover the amount of money that's in circulation. I mean, if your gold is this much and your amount of money is printed out there directly one-to-one, balances this out, then clearly there's enough gold in the central bank to back that up. And no one was going to call the United States' bluff if that went up even a little bit, or even a little bit more. But as the Vietnam War is being waged and the United States is printing more and more money, the value of the US dollar relative to the price of gold starts to become up for question. Okay, and so that's why global investors were starting to maybe get a bit nervous about the linkage, the ability of the United States to make good on its promise to link gold with the dollar. And so Nixon, who was the president at the time, and this is the beginning of the so-called Nixon shock, decided to delink the US dollar from gold, basically because the French and the Germans and the Japanese all called America's bluff, and rightly so in a way, because it was a false economy. The United States was not doing what it was supposed to be doing, and it would have been a lie if the gold standard had continued any longer under those circumstances. So that's an interesting situation for us, right? Because it means that the United States, having been the preeminent global economic power of the last 30 years, all of a sudden its power, its ability to accomplish whatever goals it wanted, to be the global economic policeman, was suddenly up for review. And meanwhile, of course, domestically, the fact that the dollar was falling meant that the price of oil and other imports, was increasing, relatively speaking. So that meant the U.S. economy was not going to be doing particularly well. There was a break on economic growth, and so because you have imported inflation, if you will, it's not so much domestic demand leading the inflation, but imported inflation. That leads to a weird situation that we call stagflation, where the economy has the brakes on it because of the price of imported goods, and also the price of imported goods is starting to rise because the dollar is not maintaining its strength. So this leads to a really, really tricky situation. The Keynesian deal of the last 30 years was designed for when demand at home was weak. But this wasn't a situation necessarily where demand at home was weak. It was a situation where inflation driven from overseas and the collapsing price of the dollar was the main threat. So how was the United States going to get itself out of this? Well, this means the supply side economists, as opposed to the demand side economists, start to appear on the scene again. And as you know, these guys tend to be favored more by conservative policymakers. They are largely interested in using monetary policy to regulate the economy. So what were they arguing? They were arguing basically that the United States, the way out of it was to become more competitive, that our costs were too heavy, and that in order for America to return to prosperity, these costs would have to be cut down. So, and also, by the way, you needed a tight money supply in order to combat inflation. So they were going to do two things. They were going to combat inflation, which meant attacking the wage, actually, and they were going to try to make America more competitive, basically, by cutting down on welfare provisions and supply side fiscal stimulus to the economy. So the goal for both of these strategies would be to give the producers a more free hand to invest in the economy. And to a certain extent, they were going to be successful in doing that, but at what cost? And oddly, as you'll see, as part of our story, is that Bill Clinton and other liberal presidents were going to be central in that, because after all, it was Jimmy Carter who appointed Paul Volcker, I believe, and Volcker was one of the central figures in the so-called Volcker shocks, which were anti-inflationary strategies whereby interest rates were set very, very high in order to defeat organized labor and the demand of organized labor for continuously high wages. Now, one important concept that is useful here in telling this story is the Laffer curve. The Laffer curve is founded on this idea that tax rates can not necessarily be stretched infinitely upwards, right? You obviously have a trade-off the more you tax in terms of economic activity. The more you tax, the less motivation entrepreneurs will have to invest, for example. So you're going to constrain economic activity if there's a lot of tax. And what Laffer was proposing in the curve was that there's two scenarios where the government is plausibly not going to make any tax revenue at all. those would be the tax rates of 0%, in which case the government can't survive at all because there's no tax revenue coming in at all, or 100%, in which case the economy is completely choked off and there's no possibility of raising tax revenue at all either. So the question is, what's the point at which these two phenomena trade off with each other, right, between tax and economic activity? The idea here is that you can kind of have your cake and eat it too. You can tax and grow the economy if you set your sights at the sweet spot where taxes are not that much of a constraint on growth, and the economy will still grow. And if the economy, of course, is growing, even if I don't have my taxes set very high this year, the proportion of the economy that I'll be taxing next year will be flat, but the real amount adjusted for growth will be a lot higher. So therefore, I can safely count on my taxation to give me a return over the long run. So this is kind of central to the conservative idea of needing to balance the budget, of needing to have realistic taxes, and kind of getting government out of the way. Now, I should mention the key sort of turning point in all of this is Ronald Reagan. Reagan was a firm believer in supply-side economics, and his victory brought about the legislation that America started to see this turnaround in tax policy. So within 3 years of his coming to office, he had cut taxes by 23%. He'd given large tax breaks for the wealthy and for investors. Clearly, then, he is sort of one of these people that's talking about putting the economy first. And indeed, he did have some success, it must be said, right? He did reduce the inflation rate. He did bring that under control. And there's a lot of story about why and how he did that. For example, he took on the air traffic controller union and fired them all, famously, by way of making a point that he was opposed to organized labor, which of course didn't want to pay the cost to labor of higher interest rates, right? So it makes perfect sense. If interest rates are high, labor's going to suffer because there's not as much money going into salaries, there's not as much money going into making new jobs. So high interest rates really do hurt labor. By forcing labor to reduce their costs so they can be competitive and keep their jobs. But so Reagan was a success in doing that. Many people praise him for this, but because he cut taxes so much, and this is the paradox, right? And because he actually, in a way, ended up as a Keynesian economist in his own way, because he increased military spending enormously. He left America with sort of the worst of both types of policy. He got the debt, but not so much the growth. And he combated inflation, but certainly wasn't. It would be erroneous to say that the country was prosperous or set up to prosper during his time on watch. Things were recovering towards the end of his administration, and George Bush witnessed that. George Bush Sr. witnessed that a little bit, but famously George Bush Sr. was hit by Clinton, who had policymakers and advisors who said this famous line, it's the economy, stupid. And why Clinton won was because the deficit was so high after 12 years of Republican presidents. Clinton really had a job to fix the economy. And many Democrats praised Clinton for fixing the economy, by the way, but as we'll see in the next slide, it's not entirely clear that he deserves praise because of the way he singularly sort of focused on the economy and rescuing the economy, and not necessarily on the people who compose the economy.